So here we are at the beginning of the summer, and I want to give you your summer orientation. So you've heard me speak about some of these things before, but I want to say that we're in the green season again, except it's not actually a season. It just happens to be an endless sea of Sundays that follow Pentecost, but it's not a season. So anytime you see us up here in green, it's not a season. It is ordinary time, we say, in the life of the church. It's kind of the informal term for it, which feels appropriate that actually most of the year, if we look at a calendar, is ordinary time. And that kind of jives with kind of how I move through life. It feels like most of the time in my life is kind of ordinary time. And it's nice to have a slightly different rhythm. You'll notice the liturgy is a bit simpler as we move into this ordinary time. And there are also some shifts that might not be immediately visible. So those of you who have come to Bible study before know that Pastor Matt loves to talk about the lectionary and the readings that we have that are lined up. So there's a lectionary, the Revised Common Lectionary. Revised from what? I don't know. I wasn't on that committee, but it exists. And it is a 3-year cycle of readings. ABC, ABC, ABC. Matthew, Mark, Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke. We are in year A. We are in the year of Matthew. So the gospel reading today was from Matthew. If you're wondering about John, I'm thinking he missed an important committee meeting. But I think in reality, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are understood as the synoptic gospels. Mark is the oldest of the gospels. Luke and Matthew, when they were writing, had Mark in hand and quote from him extensively. John is kind of like over here like this. And so he gets squeezed in the cracks at various times and used in various places, but does not have his own year. Now, Tim and I have had a long discussion about the lectionary through the years, and we have decided to make a mega lectionary. Now, I know you're excited, but during this time of the year, this ordinary time that follows Pentecost, basically half of the year, 6 months of it, there is an opportunity within the Revised Common Lectionary to walk a different path. And that's what we are doing. So we do that for a 3-year cycle, starting now, and then we don't do that for a 3-year cycle. What it is we are going on a semi-continuous journey. It's called the semi-continuous readings. The gospel reading is what we would read no matter what. The second reading is what we would read no matter what. But during the semi-continuous period of time, we're taking a different Old Testament reading and the psalm that it is paired with. So, what does this mean for you? Before you get too anxious, I know you're concerned. But the way this works is there's one part that is kind of interesting, I think. I've heard somebody say it's a bit like reading a serial novel. Many of the Old Testament readings from one week to the next will be sequential in verses, and so you'll get to hear a whole larger story within that. And then secondly, kind of the entertainment part of it, perhaps for you, is that from a preaching perspective, often the Old Testament reading and the gospel kind of go hand in glove. Now they are in completely different universes and have nothing to do with each other. So you can see how well the preacher does or not, depending on the week. So, there's your orientation. Today's readings that we have, curiously, are again familiar ones. We'll go weeks at a hit where they're not as familiar. I mean, we know them maybe, but aren't super familiar. The Matthew text in particular really struck me because they are familiar stories in it, but we don't usually think of them, or at least I don't, as coming from Matthew. They sound very different in Matthew. They sound different from Mark and others. In Mark, the woman with the flow of blood touches the fringe of Jesus' shawl, and Jesus turns around and goes, "Who touched me?" Whereas in Matthew and in Luke, Jesus turns around and says, "Woman, you've touched me, go on your way." It's a very different Jesus that we have in those Gospels. The other thing that's strange about this is everything, it's like Is it just me, or is there too much going on? It's suddenly, immediately. We have Matthew gets called, and then the synagogue leader comes, and his daughter has died, and on the way there, he gets sidetracked by somebody else, and then comes. It's one day. There's 52 weeks in a year. Why did this all need to be in 6 verses here? The other thing that struck me in this text today is that it's got my name in it repeatedly. This is always a funny year for me when we get to it, the Holy Gospel from Matthew. Just wait, folks, have I got a word for you? But then in the text today, also, Matthew is a character in the text. And I always read those a little closer because as much as I truly believe that my parents love me, Matthew's not usually a good guy in the Gospels. He's the guy that's like, oh, he showed up again. There he is, yep. And in the text, we're reminded of who he is. He's a tax collector, which means that he is Jewish. Jesus is calling him to follow. He's Jewish. These are kind of entrepreneur, self-starter kind of people, contractors. If you are another Jew who is not a tax collector, you might refer to them as a collaborator with the occupying Romans. Basically, if I wanted to be a tax collector for Roman-occupied Palo Alto, I would go to the Roman-appointed mayor and say, hey, I know you just put out something hoping to get $2 million this year in taxes from this community. I can get you 3. Yeah, they're all related to me, but it's okay, really. I can get 3. And then I go out and I raise 4. And, what the Romans don't know, they don't know, right? It's all good. And so then Matthew has the best house in town. How? Because of that. So, when we think of tax collectors today, it's a slightly different vibe, still kind of similar perhaps, but certainly in Jesus' day, it was a difficult occupation from the standpoint of being a part of your very own community, right? Elizabeth touched on this in the children's sermon, but there is a repeated sense here that Jesus is reaching out to people that have been excluded, people that have been pushed aside, people who have been harmed, people who have been thought less than, particularly by the religious establishment. One of the things that I think is good for us to hear when we read a text like this is that this text is intended to be uncomfortable for us as people of faith to read. And yes, us also. We have a tendency to read these texts and say, those other Christians really struggle with this. But if we're not reading this with the sense that we too struggle with this, we're missing the point of it. What happens with Matthew? Matthew has a profession. He's likely successful. He's one of maybe 2 disciples who could read and write as a consequence of his work. He is not somebody who was training to be a rabbi. When Jesus calls him to follow, Jesus is saying, I think you have what it takes to be one of my disciples, to follow me, to learn from me, to do the things that I do. It is a high honor. Matthew drops everything, walks off, and follows Jesus. Now, if we're part of the religious crowd around, we're thinking, wow, that guy? No, let's not have him follow us. Then there is a dinner, and all of the wrong people have been invited. Now think about this. When we think of maybe our culture in the United States and the broad spectrum of how Christianity is represented, when we read this text, we should understand that Jesus adds people to the dinner list that we, yes, even we, would not choose. I think this text challenges us to understand that it is not possible for our grace and mercy to be as big as Christ's. And what does that mean for us? I think we should always be kind of wrestling with that. There was a great drawing by Daniel Erlander, who is a longtime beloved Lutheran theologian, and it shows a picture of like an oversized Jesus with this whole crowd of people, some of whom were a little rough around the edges. And the quote is from somebody standing off to the side, "I love it when Jesus comes, but he always brings all of his friends." It's like, this idea that somehow people are to be kept away, that Christ is somehow to be policed in a way, kept apart. Who can come up and receive the host, right? We have cousins with the same last name denominationally, for whom there are strict rules as to who can come and who cannot. Now, we maybe don't have that same hang up, but I bet people outside of our tradition would say, "Hey, but ELCA, I've got a short list of things that you could be working on," and that would be fair. How do we listen? How do we learn? How do we open our hearts in ways that are maybe not obvious and clear to us? When we look at the rest of the story here, this suddenly, immediately business that's happening, all of this healing, these are people that were to keep their distance from Jesus. They were unclean. They had been separated for their community. 12 years of hemorrhaging. What in the world does that look like in first century Mediterranean medicine, right? Money spent over the years, painful treatments, difficult life, separateness from community. We can imagine all kinds of terrible outcomes. The woman touches the fringe of Jesus' prayer shawl, his cloak, and is healed. And Jesus turns around to her and doesn't say, "Hey, cool, you've been healed." He should have said, "Hey, whoa, you're not supposed to be just going around touching people like that." But he doesn't say that either. He says, "Daughter, your faith has healed." No, he doesn't say healed. Do you remember the word? Saved. Your faith has saved you. This word saved and healed being the same word is interesting. In North American Christianity, being saved generally means something else. But this idea that somehow in Christ, when we did not deserve it, we have been healed, saved, or maybe even better, made whole. Made whole. Returned to our rightful, healthy place in community. I think there is a lot of power in that. The other piece that I want to leave with you today is related to the unrelated first reading, as I was mentioning before. We hear the Genesis account where God is calling Abram to go somewhere else. But just note the details of how this story works. Abram has servants and has animals and flocks and all kinds of things. He is a wealthy man in the land of his parents and grandparents, the place where his ancestors are buried. And God says, "I'd like you to get up and go to a place that I will show you." You're like, "How about you tell me where it is now, and then I'll kind of evaluate and see if I want to go or not." No. It's a place I will show you. And he gets up, takes his family, his belongings, leaves the graves of his people behind, and goes, trusting that God will show him. So I think to sum up these different stories that we have here is that God calls all of us, be it Matthew, be it Abram, who knows who it might be, but that it often involves getting up and leaving something behind, and that there is perhaps an opportunity and openness to that happening. And then secondly, I would say, another piece of the puzzle is that God is calling and inviting others. Maybe not people that would be on our list of people to invite, And how is Christ calling us to open our heart to them as well? Amen.